Welcome to our special edition of the Leaders of Our Industry interviews. Today we have the Honourable Phil Twyford, who is the Minister of Urban Development, Transport and Economic Development. Hi Phil, thanks for having me here today.
Hi James, good to be with you.
Good man, thank you. So, can you tell us a bit about your somewhat new role here in Parliament?
Yeah, so I've got a really interesting mix of portfolios. The transport and urban development obviously go hand in hand and are really about the powerful forces that shape our built environment and our towns and cities. We're putting a big emphasis on spatial planning for growth now, particularly in our high growth centres like Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Tauranga, Hamilton, Queenstown.
Oh, nice.
And transport is critical. It's really at the heart of any kind of thinking about urban infrastructure and growth and housing.
Yeah.
So they go together really well. In urban development, this is a new portfolio that we haven't had before in New Zealand. So it's about trying to think much more creatively about how government, private sector and the community can work together in a much more deliberate way to shape the kinds of towns and cities and communities that we want, to think more about urban design. We're setting up an urban development authority called Kainga Ora to do large-scale urban development projects. So, yeah, there's a lot of new energy in this area. And then my new responsibility is economic development, which is really the age-old quest in New Zealand to raise productivity, to build more prosperity, to create an environment where our firms can prosper and grow the kind of value and generate the wealth that we all want for our country. So I think the three portfolios go together really nicely.
So, it was recently announced the 2019 budget included funding for a satellite augmentation-based system.
Yeah.
It was mentioned that this technology will also improve the safety for self-driving vehicles. Now, as a land development consultant, I think this can potentially have a huge impact on our design. So my question is, do you think more emphasis should be given towards So my question is, do you think more emphasis should be given towards self-driving vehicles when designing infrastructure and master plan communities?
Yeah, well look, the new satellite-based augmentation system is going to dramatically improve the accuracy of GPS, and which currently can get you as accurate as maybe up to a few metres, sometimes 10 or 15 metres. But with certain devices and with the addition of this satellite-based augmentation that we are working with the Australians on at the moment, it can actually get that accuracy down to 10 centimetres. So not only would you know what road, for instance, a car is travelling on, but which lane they're in.
Nice.
And so one of the applications for that is obviously going to be self-driving cars. There are many people who think that driverless cars or self-driving cars are going to transform our transport system. Personally, I think it's a little early to know exactly how fast these changes might take place, but I think we can be confident they are going to bring some big changes. And it's also really important, I think, that New Zealand firms can be at the forefront of developing this technology. We've got in the South Island right now, there's a company from Silicon Valley, Zephyr Airworks, who are trialling and developing a flying car.
Yes.
An electric, unpiloted or self-piloted air taxi that they hope will be able to carry both freight and people.
Oh, it'd be good if they can battle Uber.
Yeah. So this technology is actually moving really fast around the world. Interestingly, New Zealand is very well positioned to benefit from some of these opportunities, and satellite-based augmentation systems are really going to help us to do that, both for driverless cars, but also for drones as well, which is a massive and rapidly growing global market at the moment. Should we be incorporating some of this thinking and these scenarios as we plan new land development and the expansion of our cities? I think we do. Right now we're trying to incorporate transport planning much more closely into urban development. We're trying to make sure that we're building new developments that are less car dependent, so that people have genuine transport choices, so more walking and cycling infrastructure, access to rapid transit and public transport, and not building developments that aren't properly serviced by transport infrastructure, whether it's roads or rail or anything else. But I think you raise a good question, and I think that we should be thinking about whether or not, for instance, driverless cars, how that would affect the shape of our cities, and we should be planning accordingly.
So Phil, there's far too much property that is unserviced, and this is limiting the ability for private developers to get in there and just develop. I mean, all the easy ones go, and all the hard ones with no drainage kind of just sit around. So, I mean, personally, I see this as a problem that can potentially get worse as time goes on. So my question is, what can be done about central and local government stepping in for the infrastructure provisioning for brownfields developments?
Yeah, it's a great question, James. You know, there's two things I think that are stopping our cities from growing. One is a lack of access to finance and funding for new infrastructure that enables both brown actually and greenfields development. And the other thing is a highly restrictive planning system that stops our city from growing. So our government's committed to tackling both those things. And we're going to be bringing legislation to the Parliament soon that's going to allow private financing through long-term debt or infrastructure bonds paid off over the lifetime of the asset, you know, up to 50 years, through a targeted rate on the properties in a new development. So that's going to mean that developers will basically be able to bypass councils to some extent, whose balance sheets have been a roadblock on this. You know, Auckland Council's up against its debt limits. Its ability to borrow to invest in the roads, to invest in rail, to invest in the three waters and electricity infrastructure, network infrastructure, without which new developments simply can't go ahead. That the council's inability to fund that or finance it has been a real problem. So this will help. You know, it's a mechanism that will allow private financing with a new revenue stream through a targeted rate to service that debt and pay it off. Government and councils are all still always and will continue to have to do their bit as well. So the trunk infrastructure, you know, the motorway, the state highway, the main trunk of stormwater and wastewater and drinking water, these are still going to have to be funded by the taxpayer and the ratepayer. And so I'm looking at ways that we can be smarter about making those investments on behalf of the Crown and the Council. But in places like Auckland's Southern Growth Corridor, the northwest, the north, places, high growth centres like Hamilton and Tauranga, we've got to be able to invest in the infrastructure to allow these places to grow, because if we don't, the answer is that we create an artificial scarcity of land, we drive up section prices, we make housing unaffordable, and that is the root of so many of our problems.
Okay, thank you. All right, Phil. So I've got a question from the public here. Will the infrastructure funding that is supporting residential developments ever become transparent?
Well, I think we need to make it transparent. One of the problems that we've got is that at the moment our system for funding and financing infrastructure is not transparent, and we never see the true costs of growth. You know, when we build a motorway out into the countryside, that's a huge hidden subsidy for dispersed development. And the danger is that that style of development locks in long-term inefficiencies into the economy and into the costs that those households will face for generations, transport costs, for example. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment as a government on how we can capture the true costs of growth, and I think that if we, with the new infrastructure funding and financing arrangement that we are going to be announcing shortly, where private developers will borrow money to fund the network infrastructure in their development and the connections to the wider networks. That will go a long way towards making these costs more transparent. And it will mean that the decision about whether a development goes ahead or not is less likely to be made by a council planner, protecting the balance sheet of the council by saying, you can't do this development because we don't have the infrastructure. It'll be made on the basis of commercial viability on the developer's side,
Yep.
and hopefully environmental and good planning principles on the side of the council. Because at
Right.
the moment, those things are all mixed up, and you can't tell which is which. The other really interesting issue about transparency is that our future lies in transport pricing. We're in the process over the next 20 or 30 years of electrifying the light vehicle fleet. So all of the cars, for our kids, by the time they're driving, the cars are all going to be electric mostly,
That's it.
and that's going to mean that we can no longer rely on petrol taxes to fund the $4 billion a year that we have to raise to keep the transport system moving. The most likely way we will replace the revenue source is through a satellite and GPS-based transport pricing system, where you pay by time and space how much you use the roading network.
And perfect.
Well, not only would it would generate revenue pretty efficiently, it would allow us to do demand management to smooth out the congestion peaks on our roads and motorways.
Yep.
But it would also make the transport costs associated with different development patterns really transparent. And so that would mean that, for example, if you choose to develop a new suburb out in the countryside, and you want the government to build a road to go out there, the true costs of that transport will be fully captured and internalised into that development. And I think that would be a big step forward.
All right, there you have it. Phil Twyford leading the way. Thank you.